30th July 2018, the National Register of Citizens was published in Assam, India, with more than 40 lakh of its people missing from the list. Amid widespread fears for the fate of those left out, the governmental logic behind carrying out such an exercise in the first place, and the current global order of migration within which nation-states now live, CRG and Refugee Watch Online sought to bring some clarity to the ongoing discussions. Senior journalist Rajat Ray moderated a roundtable between Professor Ranabir Samaddar, eminent journalist Mr. Subir Bhaumik and Professor Samir on 3rd August 2018.
Friends, National Citizenship Register or NRC has become a household name within a few days, immediately after publication of the draft NRC and in Assam. And a lot of people are raising questions about these political people are in upheaval, in particular in Bengal. Chief Minister Bhaumik has already expressed doubt about this thing, that whether it would spill into a civil war sort of thing. But questions about this national register NRC comes in, I would say, it's twofold. One is the question of principle, whether we ought to have NRC at all, and if so, whether it contradicts with the basic humanistic principle of migration. Because migration is a sort of natural phenomenon where people migrate from one land to another, one country to another. So whether the role of state in this capacity in forming or going for NRC would put a barrier to this phenomenon called migration. This is one aspect we need to address first. Then I ask our speakers to deal with this follow-up, possible follow-up. Already we have been seeing some of these things in the media. So what sort of possible follow-up we are attaining? These are the aspects and what would have been the ideal situation later on. So I would not waste time. With me there are three eminent speakers. One on my right is Subir Bhaumik, eminent journalist and researcher. Then Professor Ranabir Samaddar and Professor Samir. So I will start with Subir. Subir, could you please elaborate on this question that whether we ought to or must have NRC as a principle, whether the country needs that?
Well, if the country needed it, then there would be an NRC for the whole of India, not just for Assam. So the country never felt the necessity to have an NRC. Now some voices from the Hindu right are raising this issue that, since this has happened in Assam, this should happen in Bengal, this should happen in Delhi, this should happen in other places as well. The fact that, just because this has happened in Assam, and by that logic it should happen elsewhere, I'm not in a position to buy that logic. It's also a fact that NRC, the demand for NRC, or updating the NRC to be more precise, there was an NRC in 1951.
Right.
To updating this NRC as an exercise comes from the Assam agitation of the 1980s, where the demand was to produce a national register of citizens free of quote-unquote illegal migrants. That was the agenda of the entire agitation. I don't want to dwell much on that because these are all known. The point is that the people who have been associated with the agitation have kept on with it. Finally, they got some kind of mileage in the Supreme Court. Yes. The Supreme Court took the initiative, A, to ensure that this updating of NRC takes place in Assam. B, it took the initiative to actually tell the state government and the central government in which way this should happen. They also dictated the time frame. If you recall, the bench that has been handling this particular issue made it clear when the Assam government pleaded for more time, they were told in no uncertain term, your job is to make the impossible possible. A. B. when the NRC updating as on principle was accepted by the Supreme Court, there was a comment from one of the judges saying that there has been a demographic invasion in Assam, and therefore this exercise needs to be done. So in a way the judiciary has already, come to its own conclusion that there has been a demographic invasion in Assam, and therefore this whole exercise should be done. So the point here is very simple, that there is a context to which this updating of NRC as an exercise has taken place in Assam, and the involvement of the judiciary is a unique phenomenon in this, because I've seen a piece in Economic and Political Weekly, which I read yesterday, by Alok Prasanna Kumar, he's a legal expert, where he has raised serious issue about whether the court, the Supreme Court, should have got involved with this. He has raised this issue. And he has actually he's even questioned the integrity of one of the judges, because who happens to be from Assam. So I don't want to get into that. That's a controversial area. But the point is, this is a very unique thing, that on this citizenship issue, migration issue, or quote-unquote illegal migration issue, the Supreme Court has taken a role. First, in scrapping the IMGT Act, way back in the early part of this century, and then ensuring, as a sequel to that there should be an updating of the NRC, i.e. by which you can purge out all illegal migrants. So there is a particular context to this whole thing in Assam.
Yeah, I agree. No,
but this has now become a national agenda after the intervention of the Supreme Court and the obvious interest shown in it by certain political parties who know who they are.
Ranabir, how do you view this thing? Should there be NRC to our country, like some people are believe something to write their raising demands? Or this NRC itself is a welcome thing?
No, I think Subir has laid out the context, and he has pointed out the important things. What is significant in the initiative is that suppose and I wouldn't rule out that one day the government or the court might say that there will be a national citizenship register for the entire country. In some sense it exists. For example, if in West Bengal, if you try to, have a Aadhaar card, or if you want to be a voter, the first thing that they ask you is that go and find out that whether in the population register your name is there or not. So what is interesting is that it begins with Assam, and I wouldn't rule out that it will not be, this idea will not be executed elsewhere. But what is interesting in the whole thing is that, and this has reference to your second point, migration. I do not think the aim is so much to expel people.
Yeah.
The idea is that can we nationalize the population? Can we have the right kind of Indian population, which the state would think is homogeneous, is proper or adequate or commensurate with what India is defined as. And this is happening not only in India. In countries of Central Asia, a big example is Mauritania, near abroad, Burma, Myanmar, everywhere in Bhutan, where you will find that migrants who had been in the country for, let us say, 4 decades, 5 decades, 6 decades, or 7 decades, now they will be told, prove your documents and everything, and therefore the whole question of legacy papers, etc., etc. So, on the citizenship question, it's not so much to force people out, but to create a whole subclass of people who will work as labor, who will be disenfranchised as rights. Some of them will be scared by being sent to detention camps, and it is only now that detention camps are now, they are being reported. But on the other hand, the detention camps were there for the last few years. Yes. Only now journalists are saying that, well, my mother was sent to a detention camp, my aunt was sent to, my uncle was dragged there, etc., etc. Still now nobody has written of the condition of the detention camps. But But the point that I want to connect with this and with which I shall stop here is that this idea that you can have a citizen and at the same time a subclass of people who will not be citizens is done through precisely by linking citizenship with blood. Now, till now we had the idea that it will be jus soli or jus sanguinis. Jus soli means that you are born here, so you are given citizenship here. Jus sanguinis would be that you have to prove by your blood that you are an Indian or you are an English, British or you are a French, etc. You will see slowly the push is towards making blood the criteria. So how do you prove that you are an Assamese? How do you prove it? What is the yardstick of proving? In many other countries, there could be that I have stayed here for 20 years, 30 years. I can claim citizenship. In several other countries, including India, it was the case that my child is born here. In fact, in many of the cases, Bangladeshi immigrants took precisely that step. They would come here, marry and stay for 15 years, the child is born, the child then becomes an Indian citizen. Now, to avoid all these things, because then the right of the soil, so when you say that the sons of the soil will be citizens, it doesn't mean that those who are linked to soil, that means the peasants. It doesn't mean that you will have your ownership of soil. Your ownership of soil is not important. What is important is that you have to prove this whole fictitious thing about a certain kind of blood that you should have in order to prove that you are of Assamese identity.
I think, Rajat, this is actually linked to political power. So that you,
so I will stop here now and then,
a certain community which thinks it's indigenous wants unfettered control over political power, and therefore they see the rising population of the migrants as a direct threat because of the equal representation factor, one man, one vote factor. So you need a subclass to keep this particular population out of the political matrix so that they influence
only
political power. You will hear in Assam, Samir will bear me out, they talk here that in 20 years there will be a Muslim chief minister in Assam. This is a talk.
I think the context has already been laid out, but I will just sort of carry on from whatever discussion has taken place. My first point is this, that it's not peculiar to whatever is happening in Assam, but it's a worldwide phenomenon where, for example, you have a very restrictive definition of citizenship. In other words, our textbook definition of citizen and non-citizen needs to be rethought in a way so that between these two poles you have different categories, different layers. And as Ranabir has said, that there would always be a substratum of disenfranchised people who would remain there, whose labor would be essential for the larger primitive accumulation of the kind of capitalism that we are experiencing. That point is well taken. And I think that the larger anxiety on the part of the state, this brings me to the second point, is this, that how you actually, what are you going to do with these 40 lakhs, 7,000, 707 odd persons. Now you can actually do either of the two things, and there is no other alternative. One is, for example, to push them out, but then you have, for example, this has been made so much. This is so much a knowledge of public domain that Bangladesh has already started saying that no, this is India's internal problem. Although very recently Bangladesh has on record accepted 55 maybe, 55 Bangladeshis, quote unquote, who are actually illegal entrants into India. So this is one part of the story. But the other part of the story is that what are you going to do with these people? And detention camp, and you know that in Assam you have a surge of literature in Assamese or in Bengali as well, where you have the chronicles of or first person accounts of how these persons have been nabbed. Legally illiterate people, quote unquote, and I don't know what does this legal literacy mean. Summons were apparently served, but they didn't know that this actually came in the form of summons. So they never reported to the competent authority. and suddenly one fine morning they are actually put into a jail. So jails actually serve, prisons, pure and simple prisons, they serve as detention camps. They become the euphemism for detention camps. It's only very recently that they are sought to be quarantined. And I wondered that you will have largest Auschwitz-like camp in Assam. No wonder, because you know that it's a bizarre Kafkaesque world where you are actually dealing with not just 100 people or 150 people, but millions of people, and you don't know what you are going to do with them. So I think, but having said it, I would say that the state, and I don't think that the state will retract, because the state will continue to do it. And this is its mode of governance. And I perfectly agree with Ranabir that a certain shift in its strategy of governance has taken place. And this shift, I won't say that this is a sudden shift. This has been taking place. Yeah. And this is over the years. And it's not specific to quote unquote the right forces or the left forces. We have ample examples where, for example, the left forces have been in cahoots with the Home Minister of India at one point of time. And there were secret parleys which happened between the Bengal Chief Minister and the then Home Minister, which were widely reported in the press. So it's across the divide, political divide. In other words, the most alarming situation is that there has been a convergence of forces. And the middle point, in other words, the dissenting voices are completely sort of sought to be pushed out of the political spectrum. And I won't be surprised if, for example, a Rohingya-like situation takes place, which means that it might take a violent course. In other words, maybe that in the second round I will have time to elaborate. Just one point, that there are certain questions in history which can't be answered. And if you can't answer the question, what do? Either you don't ask the question or you change the question. I think that it's time that we forget the question. And history doesn't beg solutions to every question. Certain questions simply disappear in history.
Subir, may I remind you that you have been talking about the political compulsion for going for this kind of in Assam. So would you please explain and elaborate on that point?
Actually, there is quite a contradictory pull in this whole exercise. Now the BJP, which propagated and played out the politics of Hindu consolidation in the last election, trying to get the Assamese, the Bengali Hindu and the tribal Hindus in one platform, and thereby counteract the huge Muslim vote, the voter population. They came up with this idea of a citizenship amendment bill. Now, do you realize something? That the citizenship amendment bill, if it goes through, it's not going through at the moment because of severe resistance from a lot of Assamese, regional political forces. They don't want it. They think it violates the principles and terms of Assam Accord. But if the citizenship amendment bill happens, then automatically a huge population who may have found their names ousted, the Hindus to be more precise, whose names are not there, the Hindi-speaking Hindus, the Nepali-speaking Hindus and the Bengali-speaking Hindus, whose name is not figured in the NRC and who are now jumping up and down and were upset and were scared. Somehow, the BJP goes to them and says कि citizenship amendment bill आ जाएगा तो भाई आपका तो नाम वैसे ही आ जाएगा, आप क्यों हल्ला कर रहे हो? This is not for you. So they are targeting someone. On the other hand, Assamese, regional political forces, there has been an understanding between these two, but there is also a sharp difference. For people like Promula Mohanta, the Assam Accord is sacrosanct. For people like Promula Mohanta, anybody who entered Assam after 24th March 1971, be it Bengali Hindu or Muslim or Nepali Hindu or anybody, is a foreigner.
From other countries.
From other country, is a foreigner. But for the BJP, that's not the case. They are saying, and the BJP is now giving a very interesting logic. They are saying Indira Mujib Accord happened because Bangladesh came on the horizon in 1971 as a secular democratic republic. But subsequently, Shah turned it into an Islamist republic, and therefore the Hindus there face systematic persecution, and therefore there is a case for giving them citizenship as and when they come to India. You know, keeping in mind the commitment of the national leadership way back during the partition. So there is this introduces a completely new thing. Here,
you mean to say that the 2016 Gazette notification of Indian government saying that the minorities coming from Pakistan and Bangladesh.
No, I'm talking of the Citizenship Amendment Bill, which is now placed in the Parliament and which is in a select committee.
But that Gazette notification has also the same reflection.
That bill clearly says that persecuted minorities from Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh. Right. There's not much of an issue with Pakistan and Afghanistan here because the numbers are small. Yeah. But Bangladesh, well, that sets everything, topsy-turvy, especially in states like Assam and other parts of Northeast, where the regional forces see both the Bengali Hindu and the Muslim or even the Nepali Hindu as an outsider and as an unwelcome outsider, whereas the BJP would try to differentiate because the BJP from 1980s during the Assam agitation itself, the RSS was trying to penetrate this Assam agitation. They were making it very clear in places like Kachar that we treat the Bengali Hindus as refugees and the Muslims as infiltrators or economic migrants. So they have been making this designation for a long time. Now here there is a very classic case where the Hindu right in India and the Assamese sub-regional forces have cooperated and collaborated on an electoral platform, and that led to the victory of the BJP-AGP alliance in 2014. And that alliance has been there since 2001. But the point here is there are also substantial difference in the way they look at this whole issue, and therefore, on the one hand you have NRC, where anybody after 71 is out, and then you have this amendment which says anybody after 71, but if you are a persecuted minority, you have a chance. You're going to actually get your naturalization, citizenship through naturalization in 6 years instead of the 11 earlier under the Act. So here I would imagine that post 2014, the Indian state, and I'm not getting into who rules the country now and all that, everyone knows it, has actually complicated the already complicated situation in Assam very substantially by going ahead with the NRC, which of course they did not have a choice because it was pushed by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court even pushed the time frame very hard, commenting that, your job, when people like Pratik Ajayla and others, their legal counsel appealed for more time, they were told that your job is to make the impossible possible. But this whole thing that you have a citizenship amendment bill on the one hand, and then you have an NRC exercise going on the other. Don't they contradict each other in many ways? And how this is going to play out, my only fear is me and those of us who have followed Assam for a very long time, we know how combustible the state is and how a small match dropped somewhere can ignite the fires. I am not getting into this Mamata Banerjee's, civil war analogy and all that. We don't want any kind of war or any kind of problem. The point is, the potential for conflict is very dangerous. And this has partly been created by the state.
So, you see, I will, reinforce something which Samir had said, that this is a part of the new way to govern. And therefore, on one hand, you want to have opening up of the Northeast, Lookist, etc. But precisely, and this also reflects on the way we studied our own, migration theory, refugee theory, etc., that we did not see it enough as a problem of how to govern, that it's a part of governance. And therefore, that to be neoliberal, to globalize, means that you have to be also homogeneous. That it requires that you have the right kind of territory with the right kind of population. So, which we say the right size and the right kind of people you need in order to open up. And in some way, therefore, the point that I was raising, and I think Samir and Subir both they would agree, that the classic citizenship period, which is the rise of democracy, let us say from 1870, 1890 to 1980-90, you have nation, citizenship, social rights, political rights, etc., etc. But that...
And the right to naturalize.
Yes, but that age of citizenship is over. And it is in that sense that I am telling that the whole problem of NRC actually opens up, and it is only, therefore, how would you put it, the divine justice, that law becomes the catalyst for opening up, which law probably didn't want. Law wanted to stabilize it.
Right.
Should we say, why did Supreme Court get involved in it? Apart from any incidental factor, personal factor, the factor is that law thought that the anomaly should be removed and things should be clarified. But precisely it's a world where the moment you have opened up the question of citizenship, you have opened up a can of worms. What do you do with that? And we never studied migration, including CRG. We were also groping our way that how do we really theorize the whole question of forced migration and migration in the broader politics of the time and the age. So you will see that let us say the response of people like Hiren Gohain, the response of our CPM leaders in West Bengal, the response of including very eminent human rights activists. I am telling you, if I don't want to name names, why the response is so timid. I do not know whether it has struck you. It's an extremely timid response. Let's say a person like Sanjeev Borua, who keeps on writing in Indian Express. Apparently because, again, not to speak ill of him as a person, he is a well-known scholar, etc., who has written very good things. But apparently, at one level, he says that, look, if you drive for homogeneity of citizenship, that look, this is what will happen. Samir says it's a Kafkaesque situation, Sanjeev Borua says it's a Hannah Arendt-like situation, etc. But on the other hand, he cannot say that, look, this citizenship politics has come to an end. The moment you want to say that this nation belongs to a citizen, you are faced with the problem, who is a citizen, and Samir says that it's a historically impossible question. That is where I would, have my difference. I would say not only that. If you look into history, let's say Mexican immigration into United States. I read, spate of, it's a fascinating book about law and citizenship. It's a story about late 18th, early 19th century to 1850s, 60s, where in the courts they have to constantly decide who is an American, meaning who is an United States of America. And each time the question was being discussed in the court, they had to decide, does he or she carry the American blood? Who carries the American blood? Now, Hispanic can be a blood. Hispanic is a language. But in all cases, there were Chicanos, there were Mexicans, and were they enough Americans? There was no solution to that, and we knew that it needed complete conquest of California and the entire region. So there is a history. I'm not saying history is a full guide to that. So I think that the question that who is a citizen, if this has been opened up by history, at some level using bit of Marx language, I don't want to say this is a good thing, but in some sense it's the unconscious locomotive of history. In some sense we are now faced with the question of the time, will citizenship be any more a guide to democracy? Because if you say citizenship is the guide to democracy, then you cannot speak of inalienable rights of the migrants. Then you cannot say the migrant must have a place in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then you have to say United Nations should have a charter of rights of the refugees. A charter which is inviolable, a charter which will deal with it. I'm not saying you don't deal with it. You don't say that refugees would have. But the fact that you have to say X is a refugee, X is a migrant, X is undocumented, and Y is a full citizen means you have to strike people of Bihar. You have to attack the poor laborers of UP. You have to attack poor Bengali peasants, whether they were Bangladeshis or Bengalis or they're settled in the Assamese Jord 50 years or 40 years back. You will continuously come up with the labor flow problem. And the economic reality of all-pervasive labor and what Samir says, the increasing restriction of the political reality of citizenship, you cannot now simply make them fit well. You can't put them in a proper fitting combination. So you are now faced with the question, can you have any more the politics of citizenship as your fulcrum of your politics? So now therefore you can see Hiren Gohai-like response. It's abject, it's condemnable, and you cannot support it. But how do you explain that a lifelong left now says that this is good, the extremes are bad? Basically their stand is, this is good, but the extreme, we don't want extreme. There should be a citizen, but the rest should be humanly treated. So it's like you do a war, but you should not, kill the soldier. You should show mercy. Or I'm forgetting. Tell me the name of this who did such good work on the after the Gujarat massacre, Action Aid. I'm forgetting the retired bureaucrat. All are now saying Harshmandar. If you see Harshmandar's statement, he has invoked now the Statelessness Convention. Now, why are you agreeing? Why are you considering that it is precisely the state wants to say that there will be a large group of stateless people and there will be citizens, and we will assure you we will not drive them out. But we will then rob you of everything, like Bangladesh robbed of the Hindus, like in Myanmar, property was robbed of in everywhere that has happened, and then they will be forced to leave. And then we will say we didn't, they can come back. But they can come back only as second-class people. They will never get citizenship. And we are already saying, well, now UN Convention of Statelessness should apply. We should not drive them out. This is the way in which the left, in which people like Hiren Gohai, in which people like Harsh, all are conceding ground. So you can find people who will be speaking on Rohingyas. I don't want to name, I have a very good friend, but they are all absolutely keeping mum. On Assam, on citizenship, because they cannot redefine their human rights politics without citizenship. It is all citizenship, constitution, law. And the figure of the migrant is the ultimate abnormal. I'm just using Michel Foucault's word, that it is the ultimate subject of the abnormals. It's an abnormal subject that cannot be fit into our bourgeois knowledge of politics or knowledge of bourgeois politics. So I think that is something that we must understand, and therefore the paradox that Subir points out actually fits well. It's true. You first of all expel or de-citizenize people by saying X numbers are not citizens. Then you bring in another law, if not today, tomorrow, by saying, well, Hindus will be accepted.
It is already on the
I think I have spoken about
No, but you made some very important points. I think I have two overlapping points, and two having to do with two paradoxes, so to say. One is this, that whenever we talk about citizenship, we are reminded of that great essay, Citizenship and Social Classes. Now, as one reads through the lines, T.H. Marshall. Now, one actually gets the impression that citizenship has inexhaustible potential. It is invested with inexhaustible potential. We have reached probably a point of saturation where probably citizenship has exhausted its potential. And I perfectly agree that instead of an expansive notion of citizenship, what is happening all across the world is a Zionization of citizenship.
Right.
So it's some sort of a restriction which can metaphorically be described as Zionization. So this is a kind of paradox, but a paradox which has become the standard mode of governance in the age of globalization, and Ranabir has eloquently reflected on the connection. My second paradox is this, that that apparently the authentic dichotomy that comes to the fore is the dichotomy between citizen and foreigner. But on the other hand, within this authentic quote-unquote dichotomy, there are many other dichotomies which keep playing out. For example, the Assamese, by way of asserting their Indian identity, actually asserts their Assamese identity. And they are probably legitimately so. They are worried about their culture, their language, and I'm familiar with some of the texts which have come out from Assam and which have been coming out from Assam for quite some time. So there is always a subtext of this citizenship. But to say that Assamese collective self is projected in this narrow and restrictive way would be doing a great harm. Because that Assamese notion of the collective self, to my mind, shuttles between two trajectories. One trajectory is this restrictive, trajectory, where, for example, the Indian citizenship identity is being asserted over and over again. And sometimes you know that genuine Indian citizens living in Assam for generations have been harassed during the Assam movement as well. We have testimonies to that. On the other hand, there is another universalist trajectory of Assamese collective self, which dates back to the days of Sankaradeva. And I can cite n number of texts which have come out, particularly even during the Assam movement, which actually point out that what are the things that the Assamese must learn from the Bengalis, for example. And coming out, for example, in popular Assamese newspapers. For example, entrepreneurship. For example, the Bengali intellectuals, quote unquote, which they perceive as the courage and steadfastness. So I think that the paradox is central, and I think not just to the collective self of the Assamese, but to the collective self of any nationalism, that one is the expansive kind of nationalism which has its universalist dimension, but the other is the narrow kind of nationalism. And it's important that you know that we see some sort of redefinition of Assamese collective self at this hour as well. And as Ranabir has pointed out, that that's not probably happening.
Can I ask Subir, because they know much better than I, Samir, something. You see, what I want to ask you, because I do not know also enough, and please, if you can throw light, I know time is going up, but just one small. What I want to ask is that, something that I mentioned, but can you throw light? That in order to prove that you are a citizen, the dichotomy that Subir mentioned between, or one that you have also mentioned, and they're enlightening on this. Now, at one level, you will speak of identity, which is, let us say, quote and unquote, immaterial. You have to only explain in terms of culture, etc. But at another level, to prove citizenship, it's an extremely material exercise. In other words, you have to have X document, Y document.
It's a paperwork. It's a paperwork.
That's what it is. It's a material work. Now, this is where my, my intriguing thing, that if you find out, or if you think of what were the kind of, your documents that you required in 51, etc., these are completely, how would you put it? At one level, reminding you of the mid-19th century switchover from custom to contract, where all those things that were not in paper form to you have to be now proved in court of law, etc. So clearly Shukumar Rai's, court scenes and all that. So it's Kafkaesque in that sense. It's a trial scene where you have to prove certain things. Now, how does this play out? Because the point is that citizenship clearly means that you must be a proprietor of certain things. It has to have a certain property, and property is really in the scientific sense of the term as well as the Marxist sense of the term, which is scientific. Your property of your certain deeds, your property of your certain certificate, your ownership of certain thing which will prove that you are a citizen. And if you do not have, either because of custom or because you were so poor that you never had and you were a migrant, therefore you cannot anymore validate your citizenship claim. So your citizenship claim is now in some sense brought back to, let's say, what would have been called the possessive kind of.
Let me point out.
So that's what I'm saying. How to this? Because if you, just to, that the 51 documents, now these are all being now told, nobody, what are exactly required?
Exactly.
And the 6 or 7 type of document, each of the things presupposes that you must be possessing. It must be possessing. And so, if you are expropriated, that's why Subir, I am saying that, look, what surprises me is the way in which Marx plays himself out. That if you are disproported and if you are dispossessed, if you do not have any kind of ownership of certain things, including land, and or primarily land in this case, then you cannot prove. So that's why we say that what happens to the Diara tracts, what happens to the Chor tracts, what happens when your land goes away, what happens when you don't have any document.
You go to the state archives, in the last 4 days, there are thousands of people from Assam bursting into the state archives, because this is where they are getting a lot of these old electoral rolls.
No, this is what I'm
They're not
saying.
getting it in
that
Assam.
we never
Coming
studied.
here.
It is our
The only people who have money.
That, show me what you think of that. This is also a big paradox. Citizenship is supposedly political, cultural, spiritual, etc. But at that point,
But the markers are property.
yeah, at that point where you have to prove it,
Property.
you have only one thing. You have to possess.
Possess.
You have to have.
I think
This is what you think of it.
No, I perfectly agree. Not just possess, but it's some kind of title.
Title.
That's what I'm saying.
Ownership, some sort of ownership.
And,
number.
yes.
This is what I'm saying. This
Ownership. Now, I will make just 2 points here. One point is this, that you know that this is what I would describe as documents Raj, where your paper speaks and you have to sort of put up the papers and you have to live up to the papers. So you know that you exist for the paper and
Which is in sharp contrast to the big slogan of digitalization and paperless world. That the government is otherwise putting.
No,
Okay, yeah.
So this is one that, in other words, your existence depends on what the papers speak, and you don't exist if the papers don't speak. So when I wrote, for example, the introduction to a collection of essays on internal displacement in Assam, I said that victims don't exist. So you have a problem. But no one is suffering apparently from the problem because papers don't exist. Their papers have been washed away by floods, earthquakes, and what have you. So this is one thing. The second is that we are actually talking about that substratum of disenfranchised people who incidentally are not propertied, who don't possess land, who don't possess anything, who don't possess the papers. I describe them as people without shadows. In other words, they are ghostly existence. So you exist as well as you don't exist. You are not legal juridical personalities which would enable them to keep yourselves as citizens, which would allow you to be citizens, which would qualify you to be citizens. So you know that in other words, in a global world, and the more we live in a global world, we have another world which is not into the global world, where people don't exist, but you have masses of people who are actually herded together, whether in detention camps or wherever, but they are actually the people who suffer, and we don't care. So this takes me back to the famous saying by an eminent politician who said that we have two Indias, one India and the other is the Bharat.
So, shall we I would like to just get reactions from Subir. One is that how the Motual question is being played out in this thing, and second is what will be the possible repercussion on our Indo-Bangladesh relationship? Because these people, they are saying that the Bangladeshi people are coming all the time. They are saying these things, and now on record. So Bangladesh is also must be reacting or maybe feeling something, no?
Actually, should we respond on the Bangladesh thing because he studies it well. On the casting, I think Samir and I will just speak a line. I think that this is in fact opens up to something which we had seen in Indian partition also. That we were studying partition and most of the time the partition studies were, as you know, famous is, remembered villages to all that. You know what kind of memories and what kind of Bhadralok genealogies were being played out there. But on the other hand, it was only much later that the caste question came up and we became aware of caste realities. And clearly again, here you find the same, and it's not surprising. Who are the peasant castes? So the Hindus, again, who are being disenfranchised, as Shomi says that they are dispossessed, that they are not property, that who are they? They are the migrants. They are the persons who have reclaimed the soil. They are the persons who have made the soil, arable. So, but even knowing that, it's only politics which always opens up the things. Intellect doesn't, but it is politics which opens up. So clearly the response of the Motuas and in North Bengal, in fact, they have been active, if you ask me. If one is following it much more closely, they have been active in the last 5 or 10 years, much more than they have been active earlier. And again, you will see the land question is important there. So I think the caste question is important, and the fact that the Namashudras are, again saying that it only shows that even the caste question is now linked to migrant. But I think
no, I think much has been said. I mean, I don't have much to add to whatever has been said. But one point about the Bengalis of Barak, and it's being said, I have not actually, I didn't have the privilege of seeing the inter-district distribution of the de-citizenized, quote-unquote, or potentially de-citizenized people. But I have been following the Assamese channels very carefully for the last 2-3 days. And my impression is this, that the percentage of the disenfranchised people is fairly equally distributed amongst all the districts. So it's not simply confined to Barak Valley. I don't know how it happens. But one has also to sort of find out the inner text of it, because this has a lot to do with the caste fragmentation and all that. One point that comes to my mind is this, that that the Bengalis of Barak are certainly sort of, I would say that are orphaned in a way. Are orphaned in a way because that they don't associate themselves with the Bengalis of West Bengal, or we don't associate ourselves with the Bengalis of West Bengal in a way. I'm sorry, of Barak. I'm so sorry. And I have written on that that it's not one Bengali house that we are talking about. There are many fragmentations within it. On the other hand, that the Bangladeshis, the Bengalis of Bangladesh, they don't quite associate themselves with the Bengalis of Barak. And they actually describe themselves as Tritiyo Bhuvan, or the third world, or sometimes Ishan Bangla, or the northeastern Bengal. It's a different kind of identity which frontier identity which gets formed. And we have frontier festival of poetry and all that, which has nothing to do with the Bengalis of Bengal or Bengalis of Bangladesh. So I think that it's a different kind of world. Having said it, and I would like to bring it back to the caste question as well, that a good percentage of the Barak Valley, I can't tell you exactly what is the percentage at the moment, but it is above 50% of the people who belong to the Namashudras in Barak. And if this is so, I'm not very sure, I will have to recheck once again. If this is so, then obviously that they feel that one day they will be disenfranchised, and the Bhadraloks of West Bengal will not lead them, will not give them any way to history. So in a way they feel completely laid down in both ways. And whatever Bengali movement, linguistic movement has been taking place in Barak is actually an autonomous assertion. It cannot be linked up with the larger Bengali identity. All of us suddenly become aware about Bengali identity thanks to National Register of Citizens. So that's another kind of story. But this is not the story that the people of Barak would like to hear from us.
Bangladesh.
Indo-Bangla relations.
The Indian state, for a very long time, have believed that a friendly Bangladesh is in India's interest. The military intervention of the Indian army to create Bangladesh was inspired by this whole process, that the security of Northeast is much more strengthened if Bangladesh is a friendly country or has a friendly regime. Now, having said that, you now have a situation where the strident anti-Bangladesh rhetoric that is emerging out of this post-NRC fallout, especially from the ruling party of this country, is doing enormous harm to this whole process. It's creating huge problems for the regime that is in power in Dhaka, which has invested substantially in friendship with India. They really don't know how to, explain themselves to their own people about what they've got out of India for having done much for Indian interests, be it tackling the insurgents of Northeast or giving connectivity, transit. So here is a situation in which you talk of look east, act east, for which Bangladesh is crucial, because you look east to Southeast Asia, but first you look east to your own Northeast through Bangladesh. And if that does not happen, then it becomes much more difficult. This whole lookist thing, ends up as a cliche. The point here is that the very regime which has invested so much in this whole lookist and actist also is the same political formation from which this strident anti-Bangladesh rhetoric, shrill anti-Bangladesh rhetoric is emerging at the moment, and which is complicating. It's very, Bangladesh, the present government may have taken a line, this is India's problem, by which they mean to say, this is your problem. So we don't accept any of these people as Bangladesh. Yes. This is your problem. Hasanullah Kino, the information minister of Bangladesh, has gone on record. And yesterday, the Indian High Commissioner in Bangladesh has actually substantiated that. He said this is an Indian exercise, this is an Indian problem, and Harshvardhan Shingla. And he has said that this is in the early stages, by which it means the final draft of NRC is still in early stages. There is a lot more left, claims, objections, whatever. So there is no need to worry, there will be no fallout, we'll handle this is an Indian problem. Having said that, there is considerable unease across the border at the way this whole thing is playing out. And there again is this whole business of, globalizing, looking east to Southeast Asia, and then creating a kind of a political atmosphere which will actually undo this whole, matrix of economics and connectivity completely with this whole political rhetoric.
Yeah.
So this is again something that plays at cross purpose.
What is interesting about this discussion is that some very important questions have come out. Mainly, the very idea of pre-existing idea of citizenship, the definition of citizenship, that is being questioned now because we are confronted with the new concept or possible something is emerging. That in the time of globalization, the pre-existing definition doesn't hold good anymore. So we will have to rethink and reevaluate and assess this scenario in this new context, that the ancient idea of citizenship won't hold good, and now the society will have not only the citizens, as you people have mentioned earlier, that there will be a different stratification in the society where the people will have sub-citizen status. So this is definitely already complicating the situation. Also, naturally, some sort of tension, social tension can be seen in coming years. But for that, we will have to wait. We will have to wait and understand and try to understand all these things. Thank you very much, Subir. Thank you, Ranabir. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat.